This is Catholic Forum. I'm Bob Krebs. Michael Lichens is an editor, writer, spokesperson, and expert on weird travels and history. He has appeared everywhere from Coast to Coast AM to EWTN and a host of podcasts. His new book is titled Weird Catholic Handbook, an exploration of the fascinating and overlooked aspects of the Catholic faith, featuring bizarre and extraordinary stories that have shaped Catholicism. I would like to welcome to Catholic Forum Michael Lichens. Michael, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Bob. It's an absolute joy to join you all.
It's a pleasure to see you, and I haven't read your book yet. I must confess, but I've taken a look at some of the things that's in your book, and it looks really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to learning more about it. But before we get into that, Michael, tell us a little bit about yourself, if you would, please. What did I miss on your introduction?
You basically covered all the interesting parts about me. Uh, yeah, I'm a writer and an editor living here in Colorado, trying to make sense of a very crazy world, just like everybody else.
Yeah.
And one of the ways I try to make sense of the crazy world is I love bizarre and overlooked and what we would call weird things. I always
Hmm.
have since I was a kid. I was that kid in the family that was like, "Oh, there's the largest ball of twine on this street. I want to go see it. There's a memorial to an old battle. I want to go see that." I was that kid.
Hmm.
My parents actually were remarking to me over Christmas. They remembered when they were first moving to Colorado. I wanted to go see this famous haunted house not too far from where they were moving, and so just always done that. And uh, it led to a lot of research that I mostly did by myself until I decided to collate it into a book.
Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about that. Why did you write the Weird Catholic Handbook? How did that whole book come about?
Two things was there was prior interest, especially a couple of experiences I had that had a profound impact on my faith. Namely, when I first visited an ossuary, which is a bone church, I was expecting to go there to see something ooky spooky, but instead I got a spiritual gut punch of memento mori that left a great impression on me. It made me more aware of how the church prays for each other, both in life and death. And that left a powerful impression. This was over nearly 20 years ago, I guess. And it still has a profound effect on me. What finally kicked me into gear to write this book was that I was going through probably one of the most difficult periods of my life. A lot of just things happening all at once, changing my life, figuring out what my future was going to be, and thinking about a lot of these strange and overlooked things, the stories of saints and monsters, the weird mysteries and miracles that happen in our faith, was a source of comfort for me while I was going through that
Mm.
really ridiculously rough time.
Hmm.
And I thought maybe some others could also get some comfort or would be delighted by something new they could learn. And
Hmm.
so, like many writers, I wrote through the pain, and I'm glad that a semi-readable book came out of it.
um, so let's talk about your experience at the Bone Church. Tell
Yes,
our listeners and viewers what is a Bone Church and what actually happened to you there.
sure. So, a bone church or an ossuary, which comes from the Latin word for bone. So, it's a very descriptive name. It's a church made out of the bones of long dead people. There's a lot of historical and cultural reasons why these came about, particularly in the 15th and 16th centuries. But what happened is after generations of plague, war, and things like that happening in Europe, we ran out of places to bury the dead in some places. So a new creative ways of trying to bury the dead came about. And one of them was an ossuary. Probably the most famous one is in Rome, which I visited in 2007. Yeah, I was a college student studying in Rome at the time. And again, I wanted to go see what was sold to me as a spooky place.
Hmm.
I was not expecting to have any type of spiritual experience. I was expecting to see a curiosity from a long ago era. But as I walk into this Capuchin crypt in Rome, It's made out of the bones of 5,000 Capuchin friars that had been dead and moved to the crypt. And what's really fascinating is you first see a sign, one of the skeletal monks is holding it, telling you, what you are now, we once were. What we are now, you shall be. And it's a call to accept the universality of death. It is the most universal thing. All of us have to face it, all of us have to go through it. And that was a hit to, like I said, it was a bit of a punch to the gut spiritually. I was surrounded by people who were there praying for the dead. The man in front of me in the crypt was praying his rosary the entire time. And I had a realization through all the bits of memento mori through this church that I was being called to not just remember death, but to remember to pray for the dead, to see these Capuchin friars arranged elaborately in this beautiful crypt as my brothers in Christ. And though we were separated by language, by time, by culture, we're still brothers in the Catholic Church. And while I was praying for them, they were also praying for me. And that was, I was a new Catholic at the time. I was maybe only 3 years into my conversion. And so that was a powerful reminder to me about how big the Catholic Church truly is. That it's not just your local parish, though your local parish is very important. It's much bigger than that. It's much bigger than the diocese, than the worldwide church, even.
Mm.
It's life, death, and everything in between.
That's a remarkable story. So who should read your book, Michael? Is it for I guess it's not for kids, or maybe it could be. Was it for people new to the church, or what was your target audience?
My target audience was anyone who has ever encountered some of these strange or bizarre aspects of the Catholic Church and just wondered, why do we do that? What is the spiritual significance? So I wrote it for a very general audience. I try to keep it family friendly.
Mm.
There are some moments, of course, where I'm talking about strange and bizarre objects that might disturb a few people. So maybe if you have little kids, judge if this is a good book for them. But I would suggest maybe 12 and older.
Hmm. Hmm. So walk us through the book, if you would, please.
Absolutely. I have it set in 5 sections. The first section is called Saints and Monsters, giving you exactly what that title would deliver. I tell stories about the various saints and monsters that have encountered throughout history, but pointing out some fun examples, such as St. Columba and his encounter with what might have been the Loch Ness Monster.
Hmm.
There are tales of Christian werewolves and things like that from the Middle Ages and the Golden Legend and sources akin to that. And then I also go to section 2, which is about memento mori, the church facing death. And this is the various ways the church has encountered death, understood it, and tried to make that understanding available to others. The third section call spiritual warfare and Catholic campfire stories. And this includes, of course, things like exorcisms, the Catholic understanding of ghost stories, including looking at some great medieval ghost stories. And then we also talk about things like relics and incorruptibles. The fourth section is entirely devoted to unusual miracles, which, as I say in the beginning of that chapter, quoting G.K. Chesterton, miracles are strange because they happen. That's the most profound thing about them.
Hmm.
Whether they're small or huge, there's some miracles we just don't consider part of the canon, or we never really consider, or they just might give us the willies of first, such as stigmata or levitation.
Hmm.
And then the fifth section is just my suggestion for a strange Catholic pilgrimage. I give a list of sites throughout the world you can go to that I've talked about in the book. Some I still need to visit, but things I think are worth people's time if they have a chance, such as going to the Jubilee year in Rome. They can go to this Capuchin crypt where they can see a chapel made of bones, or they can go to a wonderful little museum that is a collection of things that are linked to purgatorial souls.
Interesting, interesting. My guest today on Catholic Forum is Michael Lichens. His book is titled Weird Catholic Handbook. It's available from Sophia Institute Press. And can you share a story or two with us, Michael?
I would love to. So I was briefly mentioned St. Columba and the Loch Ness Monster.
Hmm.
Uh, this wasn't identified with the Loch Ness Monster until much later when there was more lore around that cryptid. But it's a fantastic tale from the early church. Around the 6th century, St. Columba, who was born a little after St. Patrick, began a missionary journey through Ireland and what is now Scotland. He founded Iona Abbey, probably the most important center of Celtic Christianity. Uh, he did missionary trips all across Scotland, preaching to the Picts and converting many people. But while he was doing that, he also faced down certain monsters. And here at the River Ness, he was told by some villagers that there was a sea serpent in the river that would crawl up onto land, eat cattle, eat people. The people were afraid to go into the river because this beast was coming at them. St. Columba instructed one of his monks to get into the river to try to bring the beast out. Sure, which is the ultimate sign of obedience. Like that monk understood obedience, so he gets into the water.
Be like, are
And
you looking at me? You know?
yeah. Oh, you mean that guy? Cool. Yeah. No, usually people think of monastic obedience as, I'm going to pray the right prayers, I'm going to sweep. It's not get in the river and let's see if we can bait this monster out. But he does right away. To his credit, he trusted St. Columba enough to get into the river. And sure enough, the mighty serpent came out. It opened its mouth and made towards the monk. St. Columba was not in the least bit afraid. He instead holds up the cross and proclaims to the monster, in the name of the Holy Trinity, you will not go further and you will harm no one else. The beast was struck by this. As if hooks were in its mouth, pulling it back, it started running back and let out a mighty scream, terrifying the locals. But the beast went away, never to be seen again. At seeing this, several of the Picts who had been haunted by this demon decided to convert, as you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And St. Columba found a well and converted and baptized many of the people who saw this encounter.
That's a great story. Do you have another one? Maybe one that's not quite as frightening, because that was pretty scary.
I will tell a story that maybe is a little. Trying to think of a non-spooky story. Hold
Well,
on.
you share a spooky one. That's fine.
Oh, sure. So, one of my favorite stories that I discovered while researching this book was the story from St. John Bosco, who had an encounter with a friend of his who had passed away. This friend, Luigi, and him were very close. They had joined seminary together. John Bosco wrote about him very movingly, said that this was not a great friendship that taught him a lot about grace and how to live a heroic Christian life. And one day, John Bosco and Luigi were reading the lives of the saints, and they wondered if it was possible that if someone died, they could come and tell the living if they had been saved or not. So they made a wager. John Bosco would caution people not to make these sort of wagers, but this was, two men in their early 20s in seminary. It was a bit of a jest. They didn't realize how true it would come when a couple years later, Luigi died tragically, just a couple weeks for his 23rd birthday, I believe. It was something that hit the entire community, but it especially hit John Bosco. He was in mourning. He went to the funerary mass and he kept thinking about their little jestful wager that they made. Will he come to visit me? Will we see each other? And nothing happened at mass. Nothing happened in the hours of prayer. He remained in the chapel after mass. So he went back to the dormitory to finally go to sleep late at night, still thinking about the wager. Well, later that night, the seminarians were awoken by what sounded like a heavy wagon being dragged by horses. They first heard it outside, but then it started moving through the hallways of the seminary dorm. The rooms were shaking. They could not get a light on. And the seminarians started huddling together out for comfort because this was truly a frightening event. The noise kept moving closer to their door, and they grew more in fear. Don Bosco later wrote he never felt closer to death than that point in his life. And then suddenly the door opened, and a light filled the room, and the seminarians heard the voice of Luigi cry out, "Bosco, I am saved." And he proclaimed that 3 times before the light went away. And some of the seminarians were confused by this whole thing, but the few who knew about the wager understood what was going on. And for John Bosco, it was a great comfort to hear that his late friend had died in grace and was in heaven. So while it's a little bit of a spooky story, there's also full of hope and reassurance
Mhm.
that a lot of these stories have.
Yeah, and you're a great storyteller.
Oh, thank you.
Do you have a favorite story?
Oh, goodness. Probably my favorite just because I love the reaction of people who have never heard of it before. It's called The Wizard Clip, and this is a story that takes place in Appalachia in the 1790s. It might be the first poltergeist case in American history, and it's definitely our earliest exorcism. But it is a long story that involves a haunting of a farmhouse. There was poltergeist activity, so things moving around, fires being started. It was called the Wizard Clip because people would hear phantom shears opening and closing before they would find their objects cut up. Their house lid-ins, handkerchiefs that were secured in their pockets or in trunks would have crescent moon shapes cut into them. And the family was at a loss. They were not a Catholic family, they were Lutheran. And it took them a while before they finally found a Catholic priest who at first excused the stories and didn't believe it, but he was soon very much convinced of it. One of the witnesses of this haunting is a man who is on his way to sainthood, a man by the name of Servant of God Demetrius Augustine Gallitzin, who was a wonderful figure in American history. He was a Russian nobleman who converted to Catholicism, became the first class of priests to be consecrated in the new Republic of the United States. He witnessed this haunting, helped say a mass and an exorcism, and thankfully the spirit went away. And I'm very much overly summarizing it. This was a case that lasted years, but it
Mm.
is a fascinating one I hope to actually dig deeper into.
When you did your research for this book, was there any particular story or something that you found that really kind of shocked you?
Oh, goodness. The John Bosco one was one I had never heard before, despite
Yeah.
having read about him and known quite a bit about him. I've seen his tomb in Turin. I have a great devotion to him. Never knew he had a ghost story. And that surprised me greatly. And what surprised me even more was other saints, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, Gregory the Great. Like the list just kept going on and on of people who said, oh no, a purgatorial soul has visited me, and this is what they needed, this is what they wanted. And it was so surprising. I could have done a whole book about just medieval saints and ghosts, and
Mm.
it would have been 400 pages. But
Wow.
so there's just so many.
I understand your book is really selling well. It's a hit. What has been the reaction so far? Have you heard from any of your readers?
A few of them, the ones that surprised me the most are the people who are not Catholic who have picked it up, or people who are raised Catholic and just haven't been to church in a while, and they picked it up like, oh, this looks like a fun one.
Hmm.
And it's been a generally positive one, which I'm glad to hear because well, I'm not dogmatic. I should not be dogmatic. I'm the last person you should come to for spiritual advice or anything like that. But I did write it from a Catholic perspective, and I wanted it to be an Orthodox approach to these things. And so to hear people who are not part of the church were really enjoying it it's just as a writer, it's a delightful thing.
You mentioned that you could do another volume on medieval, ghosts and that sort of thing. So, what are your plans? Are you working on a next project now?
I'm I'm praying and discerning what I should be doing next.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I mostly wrote this book to give myself something to do in hopes that somebody would enjoy reading it. I'm glad more than a few are enjoying it.
Yeah.
So we'll see what Spirit calls me to next.
Yeah. Did you write it during the pandemic by any chance?
No, I wrote it all almost entirely between late 2023 and 2024.
Good. 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 I know a lot of the authors that I've had on recently are promoting a book that was their pandemic project. How can our listeners follow you? Would it be on your website? And I guess you also have social media presence.
I have very little social media presence these days, but you can find the little I use at mlichens.com. And you can also pick up the book at sophiainstitute.com, or to my preference, please hit up your local bookstores, especially your local Catholic bookstores.
Yeah.
They can special order it for you, and I love supporting those places.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. Well, Michael, thanks for sharing your stories with us, and thanks for taking time to be with us on Catholic Forum today.
It was absolutely my pleasure. I hope all of you in Delaware have a wonderful year.